Are police risking too much to catch criminals on the run?
I'm definitely scared, but I'm ready to face my sentence.
And adapting to an even simpler life behind bars. Paris Hilton trades in her designer duds for prison garb. Good evening and welcome to The Verdict. I'm Paula Todd. A stunning ruling at the trial of Canadian Omar Khadr today. A U.S. military judge dismissed the charges, which include murder. The judge said the commission doesn't have jurisdiction over Khadr. CTV's Tom Clark is in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and he tells us what happened.
Well, Paula, legally, this was a fascinating day, and it's going to have huge implications for the military commission system, the legal system, to try the detainees here at Guantanamo Bay. Now, here's what happened. When the judge walked into the courtroom this morning, he was the one who brought up what he considered to be an inconsistency. Now, since 2004, all the detainees here have been designated by tribunals as being, quote-unquote, enemy combatants. But get this, when Congress set up the military commissions, which was the legal system to try the detainees here, it said specifically in the congressional bill that it was only to try, quote, unlawful enemy combatants. Well, the judge said you can't have it both ways, and that one little word made a big difference. So he said, I don't have jurisdiction in this case because the words don't match. Somebody's got to go figure that out. But in the meantime, this trial is over, and I'm throwing out all the charges against Khadr, and those are serious charges. This is murder and attempted murder and assisting in terrorist activities. So where does that leave everything right now? Well, nobody's really quite sure. The American government is saying that it will decide what it's going to do sometime in the next 72 hours. It may go to an appeal, but here was another legal anomaly. They said that they would appeal to something called the Military Court of Review. Well, in fact, in law, there is such a thing as the Military Court of Review. But guess what? It hasn't been set up yet. There are no judges. There's no office. There's nothing. So they're appealing to a court that doesn't exist yet. It's part of the chaos of what's going on here. So ultimately, what's going to have to be decided is what do you do with the people down here who are designated as simply enemy combatants? And how do you make them unlawful enemy combatants? Do you put them through another tribunal process where their designation is changed? Is it simply a note sent out from the Secretary of Defense saying that they are now all unlawful enemy combatants? But if you think about it, being designated an enemy combatant is hardly something that would normally be considered against the law. In other words, firing, as say, if the United States invaded Canada and Canadian soldiers fought back and shot back at the Americans, sure, we'd be enemy combatants, but we wouldn't have broken any laws. They're trying to say, no, we're only going after Al-Qaeda and the Taliban and whatever you want to call the insurgency. So that is the difficulty in figuring all this out. But clearly there is a body of opinion in the United States and some within the military that say the only way you're ever going to get this sorted out is to put it all over to the civil courts, to the federal courts of the United States, and let them handle the terrorist charges, take it out of the hands of the military, because they've tried once, they've tried twice. This is the third time that the whole idea of military trials have fallen off the table. And as one said, 3 strikes and you're out. Paula, it's been a fascinating day down here at Gitmo. Back to you.
And our thanks to CTV's Tom Clark. Zainab Khadr, Omar Khadr's sister, spoke on behalf of the family. She said they were as surprised as everyone else by today's ruling, and she says her brother is telling them to be strong and to hang in there and to have faith. But it's obviously not easy, given his notoriety.
I mean, I think people don't perceive us in the way we'd like to be perceived. They see us as a threat, or maybe a change to their way of life, or a threat to their way of life, or maybe a threat to their security. But I think that they need to look a little bit closer and see that besides all the media and besides all the things that are being said, there's just a regular family who's going through a very difficult time. The question would be, what are they going to do with those people? I mean, a lot of people are being very optimistic about Guantanamo closing down and all the detainees being sent home, but nobody really considers the fact that even though Guantanamo might be the worst prison on earth, it is still a prison that everyone can see through. Yet prisons in other countries are just like going behind the moon. No one knows if you're alive or dead.
American officials say they can still hold Omar Khadr as an enemy combatant as long as the war on terror continues. He is the only Canadian at Gitmo, but today's decision could affect the entire judicial process and the fate of hundreds of other detainees at that facility. Jeffrey Adicott is the director of the Center for Terrorism Law at St. Mary's University School of Law. He has also worked as a military lawyer with the U.S. Special Forces. He joins us in San Antonio, Texas. Munir Ahmed is a professor of law at American University. He was also one of the lawyers representing Omar Khadr until he was fired by his client last week. Please let me start with Jeffrey. How significant is today's decision?
Well, not really that significant in the big picture. We haven't done military commissions since World War II, when we tried thousands of Germans, Japanese, and Italians for their war crimes. And there was problems back then. There's problems today. I know Judge Brownback, he's being overly cautious. I think he's probably wrong in his interpretation of the Military Commission Act, but he wants to get it settled before the trials, and we've got about 75 of them that are going to be coming, get underway, and that's probably the right thing to do because there is a clause that talks about unlawful enemy combatants, but there's another clause in Part 1 of the Military Commission Act that also says that these individuals that are al-Qaeda and supported by the Taliban in that context could be tried. So I think he's being overly cautious, but you know, these cries that this proves that the system is faulty and needs to be shut down are vastly overbroad and inflammatory.
Munir, what do you think?
I might agree with Jeffrey if this were the first bump in the road, but in fact, every single time that there's been a proceeding in the military commissions, there's been some form of chaos, to use the word that your correspondent used to describe the scene there today. This is a system that's been thrown out as unlawful once by our Supreme Court. It's one which has been characterized by countless changes in the rules and readjustments and recalibrations. And so I wasn't surprised today that, I certainly was surprised that the charges got thrown out in the way that they did, but frankly, I wasn't surprised that things didn't go smoothly, because what experience has shown us in the military commissions is that they never go smoothly there. I think the reason for that is that this is a system that the administration created from whole cloth, rather than sticking with tried and true, proven courts, whether the civilian federal courts or military courts martial, both of which are available to try individuals for war crimes. They instead invented a brand new system. And frankly, this is the trouble you invite if you try to create a system on the fly in the way that this administration has done.
So what do you think ought to happen then, Munir? Is it, if the system isn't working, if it wasn't put together properly, what do you suggest should happen to Omar?
Well, let me answer that in two ways. With regard to the military commissions, I think that they have proven time and again to be unworkable. It's not just that the administration has yet to complete a trial. It's that every time they try, they get sent back.
We've completed one trial already.
No, sir.
One conviction.
Right, and that was obtained through a plea agreement and not through a trial.
That's a conviction.
Well, it's a conviction, but it's not a trial. And frankly, if we want to talk about the Hicks case that you're referring to, this is the last Australian who was left at Guantanamo. That did nothing at all to legitimize the military commissions. We know that that was a case where the Australian government and the American government had negotiated an agreement unbeknownst to the prosecution, and then a plea agreement was put forward and forced through the commission to make it look like this was a legitimate system. We know that that wasn't the case. This was a process where...
I don't know that at all. I don't know who we is.
Well,
you might know it. I don't. It was a plea bargain that the defense counsel administered, and you know, we have a conviction. We have one case that's been successfully tried by the military commissions, and again, we haven't done this for 50 years.
It has absolutely not been tried. There was not a single evidentiary hearing.
He was convicted by a guilty plea.
But let me just jump in for a second, gentlemen.
It was a case in which the prosecutor wasn't even party to the plea agreements. It was a case that was worked out with the judge's boss. If that doesn't delegitimize the system, I don't know what does.
Well, let's talk also about the current system. What are you suggesting, though, Munir? I mean, that if you have a couple of buses that, maybe break down, you don't get rid of the entire transportation system. What are you suggesting should be done, for example, with Omar right now?
Well, you also don't create a brand new system when you've got one that works, that has been in place for years, that's reliable, and has the trust of the world. That's our federal courts and our military courts martial. Both of those have jurisdiction today. They could refile charges against Omar in a court martial. They could do it in federal district court. Those would be appropriate places to try an individual for alleged war crimes.
Jeffrey, how about that?
I would agree with my colleague if we were not at war. We are at war. Our Congress believes we're at war with the Military Commission Act, clearly. Our president believes we're at war. This is not a metaphor. And in times of war, military commissions have long been used to try war criminals. This is not a case for the civil courts. These are enemy combatants. They're unlawful enemy combatants. And unfortunately, that magic word wasn't inserted when the Combatant Status Review Tribunal looked at those cases. But these are enemy combatants. Why in the world we want to treat them as common criminals is beyond me.
Jeffrey,
when we are at war.
Before we go on, share with us your understanding of the difference between unlawful enemy combatants and the simple term enemy combatants. It is on that missing word that the proceedings turn today. What does it mean?
Well, quite simply, in time of war, the Geneva Conventions indicate that that individuals that fight in a particular manner can get the status of prisoner of war. You have to meet 4 qualifications. One of them is to carry arms openly, to be led by a chain of command, to follow the laws of war. The Al-Qaeda do not qualify as prisoners of war, but they do qualify as enemy combatants. So if you're a lawful enemy combatant, you can qualify as a prisoner of war. If you're an unlawful enemy combatant, then you're a detainee, which means we get to interrogate you as long as we don't violate other provisions of international law like the Torture Convention, which we do not. And that's what these individuals are. They're unlawful enemy combatants, but the Combatant Status Review Tribunal simply used the word enemy combatant. And that gives us the authority to hold them indefinitely under the law of war, that is the rule of law, until the war is over.
Paula, can I go back to the issue of whether it's appropriate to use military commissions? Because
Certainly.
Jeffrey said that this is an appropriate thing to do at a time of war. Well, if that's true, if we take that position seriously, then presumably anyone that we suspect of engaging in the so-called war on terrorism ought to be subject to trial by military commission. That's not the case in the United States. Rather, the military commission system that Congress created is reserved exclusively for non-U.S. citizens. So if you have a U.S. citizen who is accused of engaging in exactly the same conduct, in exactly the same place, at exactly the same time, and is picked up and charged with exactly the same criminal offense of the laws of war, that individual simply cannot be tried in a military commission. The Congress has determined that military commissions aren't good enough for Americans, and yet they somehow are good enough for Canadians.
I think that's
double
outrageous.
standard cannot apply.
I agree.
And here in the case of Omar Khadr, for Canadians, for the Canadian public and for the Canadian government, it's critically important to recognize this is a system that the American government thinks is not good enough for its own citizens, but it's plenty good for yours. And I think that speaks a great deal to the problem today with respect to Omar Khadr.
Munir, you were fired by Omar Khadr, although you seem to be mounting a fairly full defense for him here. Any idea why that happened?
I think it's actually a pretty understandable and rational decision. I think it's here important to remember that Omar was 15 years old when he was taken into U.S. custody. And in the last 5 years, he's not only been held captive by Americans, he has been abused and he's been interrogated and he's been tortured by Americans. Now that he's going before a military commission, he's being told, in order to get your trial, not only do you have to be represented by Americans, you have to be represented by an American military officer, which is to say you have to be represented by someone who wears the same uniform as as your captors and your torturers. So in light of that situation, frankly, if I were a Canadian...
These people are not tortured in Guantanamo Bay. I mean, that's just outrageous, and that's repeated time and time again. And the only source you have are these individuals that are down
there are FBI agents who have documented this. There are countless reports from government agencies that have documented torture. We also have the record.
Individuals in their individual capacity is not a U.S. government policy, and you know it.
Well, it's always that one bad apple, isn't it? Somehow it's never a systemic problem.
Munir, I wonder if you could comment, please. there's speculation about how Omar is actually doing, and much is made of the fact that he's been in prison since he was 15. Did you get an opportunity to meet with him face to face?
I've met with him many times. I've been down to Guantanamo about a dozen times in the last few years. Now, I haven't seen him since last fall, so it has been some time. I can tell you, though, I mean, look, in the abstract, we can imagine what happens when you take a 15-year-old and you drop him in a hole for 5 years. It's not good. Our experts on juvenile detention or on long-term incarceration, child psychologists, they all tell us what the consequences are of putting someone in those types of conditions. But I think also it's important to remember that he was never treated in an age-appropriate fashion, which is to say, since the day he got to Guantanamo, he's been treated as an adult. And I think that's taken a real toll on him.
So, Munir,
it's worn him down.
That's what I want to know. When you talk to him, does it seem as if he's capable of understanding what's happening to him?
Well, in some ways he is. I mean, the way I would describe him is that in some ways he's wise beyond his years because he has been forced to do a tremendous amount of growing up in a short period of time in a very hostile environment of Guantanamo Bay. At the same time, though, he has retained a kind of stilted, almost frozen sense of being a child. And so there's this odd mix then between him, and it's simply because his development from adolescence, which he was in at the time he arrived at Guantanamo, to adulthood, which he now is entering, has been a really uneven one. And so his state today also is quite uneven.
I appreciate that information. And our thanks, of course, to terrorism law expert Jeffrey Adicott, who had to go a little bit earlier. He is in San Antonio. And, of course, to Munir Ahmed, who is in Washington. The prospect of a celebrity witness was quashed at the CONRAD Black trial today. There were rumors that fellow millionaire Donald Trump was going to testify for the defense, but Black's lawyer Eddie Greenspan crisply announced that wasn't going to happen and didn't say why. CTV's David Aiken is following the trial. He is in Chicago. He joins us now. What happened, David?
Well, you know, talking around